This is episode 370 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access special bonus history content when you sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned for even more details.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Lemon, professor of English at the University of Southern California and author of Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
There's so much heat in the metal. And the furnace itself, for casting bells by Shakespeare's time, they're more using something called a reverberatory furnace, which could be 3 meters long by 2 meters high by 2 meters wide. And that used wood at one end, and the flames were carefully led over the metal, and the heat reverberated off the roof down onto the metal.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Orlando from the play As You Like It talks about church bells knolling. And later in that same play, the Duke talks about how we, quote, have with holy bell been knoll'd to church, end quote. There's a conversation in Act II of Pericles where two fishermen discuss a parish getting swallowed by a whale, and they refer to the parish as the whole parish, church, steeple, bells, and all. These references demonstrate the important cultural place of bells in England for Shakespeare's lifetime. While Moses is credited with introducing bells to Jewish religion, Italian monks are given credit for introducing bells to Europe, with Saint Bede bringing them specifically to England when he introduced their use in funerals around 700 AD. By the time William Shakespeare was walking around, metallurgy and construction had experienced a metamorphosis, with churches in Europe adopting not only intricate design, but seeking to increase both the size and the sound of their church bells. Here this week to tell us about the history, size, shape, sound, and technical process of building a church bell in Shakespeare's lifetime is our guest, Guthrie Stewart. Guthrie Stewart is a chemist and materials scientist specializing in recreating historical recipes for ink and alchemy. He's the author of Alchemy in Medieval and Tudor England. Guthrie sometimes runs the replica 16th century bronze foundry at Kentwell Hall in Suffolk, where he works on historical methods of bronze and pewter casting using authentic materials. Guthrie catalogs his journeys into historical alchemy as the Backyard Alchemist on the X platform, as well as at his blog and website. I'll place links to Guthrie's book and his resources in the show notes for today's episode. Just a reminder, if you would like to see visual history content related to our conversation today, including woodcuts, illustrations, museum artifacts, and primary documents related to the creation and existence of bells and even famous bells in Shakespeare's lifetime, you can find all these extras for patrons of our show on the regular show notes page. Go to CassidyCash.com/episode 370 and click on detailed show notes to expand all the extras while you listen to the show. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Guthrie. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, Cassidy. It's good to see you.
Were church bells cast inside a foundry that would have been dedicated to bells, or was there just like a general foundry for making all kinds of metal craft, and church bells would have been one of those projects completed there? How was this set up?
Most of the time it was the second, because bells were so big and complicated, and it took a week or two to make them, depending how quickly you were working, that you would have a foundry in a big town like London or Leicester or York or such that would make bells when requested for churches around and about, generally within sort of 10, 20 mile range, depending how far people were willing to pay for transport. So probably most of the bells are made in major foundries in major towns, often run by the same family for 2 or 3 generations. Or sometimes they'd only last 5 years and shut up shop for whatever reason. We don't really know why. One in Exeter, I think, ran for about 3 generations, about probably 60 to 80 years in the late 15th, early 16th century. But there were also itinerant bell finders, some of whom made a living just out of travelling to places to cast bells, or else sometimes they just came out from Leicester or York or London or something to cast a bell in the local town or village or something, depending on what the customer wanted, how far away it was, or, to use a itinerant bell founder, if given the costs of carriage and the chance of dropping it off the cart or something, it might actually be cheaper to make it locally. Plus, you could watch the work being done yourself and go, "Oh, are you sure you're doing that right?" And the craft bell finder will probably tell you to go away. Or else, also, frankly, if it's very big, because apparently the Great Tom of Lincoln was close to 5 tons or thereabouts. And therefore, if it was that big, carrying it by cart would just be too difficult. So it was easier to make it locally.
Because, these are not small. Give us, you said that the bell was named Tom of Lincoln. Am I saying this correctly? Was 5
Great
tons.
Tom, yes.
Was that average size for church bells, or how big were they?
Well, that's what I was trying to dig into that a bit last week, and actually it looks more like most of them were more sort of 2 to 3 feet across and sort of roughly 3 to 1,200 weight, which is still only about 150 to about 600 kilograms. Not sure what that translates to in imperial, but not actually that much, significantly less than a car. Because essentially there's an interesting website called Dove's Guide for Church Bell Ringers, which has a huge database of bells across the world. So you narrow the search down to England or British Isles. So I searched for 1550 to 1650 in British Isles, and it listed about 5,310 bells for that century. And a quick scan through it suggested that most were only in sort of half-ton sort of range, nothing too big. So they wouldn't necessarily be too hard to carry, and actually not too bad size-wise.
So you need a solid cart to carry things and a good set of horses, I think, to pull it. But to translate 600 kilograms for you, that's about 1,300 pounds. And I did Google that. I'm not just a math translator so fast, but some things to compare that to. It's about the size of a baby grand piano, or ChatGPT says that it's about the same size as a male polar bear, but I'm not, I don't personally know that reference. But still very big. I mean, to fit it on the back of a cart, you're not fitting multiples of these into your cart. You're definitely doing one at a time.
Oh, exactly. But then even in Shakespeare's time, a church could have 6, 8, 10 of them, maybe. So they would sort of accumulate over time almost. People left money in wills and everything, or they were acquired in various other ways. So I think that would be your later questions, of course.
So transporting them was really difficult, but once they got them in place, were they difficult to ring? I mean, how did you make them sound?
Once they're in place, they basically, by in place, we mean strapped to a large timber beam with sort of rolling bits at each end, so the whole bell can rock back and forwards, and usually so iron straps or lots of heavy rope. Well, essentially, the earlier you go, the simpler it is, and it's literally just a small rope running down the side of a church that's attached to the clapper. So you just yoink the rope back and forth, and the bell sounds simple. And then the bigger the bells got, the fancier everything got, the higher up they got. And then at some point in sort of later medieval period, they worked out you could put the whole the big wooden stock that the bell is attached to on a kind of cartwheel-like devices either end, and then run the rope. Then the whole bell could then be rocked side to side. And then eventually, later in Shakespeare's time, they worked out change ringing, which involves effectively turning the bell all the way over, or at least half all the way over, almost all the way over, and then back again in a controllable fashion. So the way they actually made it ring changed even just over sort of 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in quite an interesting way.
Were the bells ever used to play songs, or was it always just to make a chime?
Generally, in medieval times, it seems they they quite like them to sound together. So you might ring them all together or else ring them one after the other using the different ropes, but there wasn't necessarily any great skill involved. And then over the 16th into 17th century, like I said, they invented change ringing. So the bell could basically, at that point, they started playing what would almost be songs to us, but it's a way of repeatedly ringing the bells so that none of them, you never repeat the same pattern. That there must be some interesting sort of thoughts about that, but I haven't quite found them. It's quite complicated to look into, but there's been a few papers and articles on that sort of topic. So basically, from my notes, there was a researcher called Catherine Hunt who mentioned merchant and diarist Peter Mundy, who wrote in the 1650s after decades abroad, who said, describing what was to him quite a new sound, the sweet ringing of our tunable bells, especially in changes in London when he got back after 30, 40 years abroad. So on the other hand, there's other evidence suggesting that by 1600 or so, change ringing was sort of invented or becoming more of a thing. Groups of young men would gather in the churches and ring the bells. And I'm assuming they were trying to ring them in a nice song-like manner. Otherwise, people would certainly have complained and stopped them doing it long before if they were doing it badly.
I know that the base of the history here was formed around funerals. I know Saint Bede is credited with ringing bells in association with a funeral, but for Shakespeare's lifetime, was a funeral the only time that a bell would have been rung, or what other occasions would have called for a ringing of the bells?
Well, if you remember John Donne's poem, Ask Not For Whom the Bell Tolls, apparently Shakespeare paid for bells at Southwark Cathedral to be rung at the funeral of his younger brother, Edmund, in 1607. So yeah, as you say, that's one major use for them. But effectively, there were all sorts of other uses, basically to warn of danger, fire, storm, sometimes to try and drive away disease or bad weather, because often the bells would have been blessed and there were sort of associations with them carrying out, being able to sort of scare away bad things. But whether they were still doing that by the 1600s, I'm not so sure. But it was definitely something done in medieval times. And there was some argument during the 16th century when Shakespeare was younger about what the correct use of church bells was. For instance, a statute injunction of Edward VI in 1547 ordered that number of bells in church should be reduced to one. So you just have one practical bell to call the faithful to service, and maybe mark the important point of any service or call them to the sermon, which is kind of what it was used for in the Catholic times as well. Or indeed for tolling for the dead and for warning of danger and such like. Oh yes, it could also be used for any curfew. And there was a divinity professor at Cambridge University said the bell should be rung with different sounds so that people know whether they're being called to worship or to listen to a sermon, or whether it's for other public service, like they're being public business, like they're being called to witness something or that a fete is opening or something.
I love the idea of church bells being able to ward off bad things. I think I'm going to look at bells a different way, knowing that was part of their lore or what their beliefs around bells.
Well, there seems to have been a proper procedure for, or at least a generally understood rough sort of procedure for blessing the bells at various stages in the making, if they're being made in the churchyard. And some, at least once or twice, they were actually made within the church itself. Interestingly enough, they've actually dug up the remains of the bell casting pit and the furnace inside the church. So then bless the bells, hoist them up, make sure they're all properly blessed in various ways. And then I suspect that had died out by Shakespeare's time, but still people would remember that the bells were blessed in part of the church.
Shakespeare's plays make it seem like the church bells would have not only been located inside a steeple, but that the bells themselves represented or were at least a symbol for entire parishes. He sums them up as the whole parish and then lists off, the church, the steeple, the bells, and all is the quote from the play. Is that accurate about the place of church bells in the culture? Was it a symbol of the town?
I think pretty close, yes. I think it varied a bit depending, partly, and how people usually have a certain pride for objects, whether they've contributed money to help buy them or whether they've rung the bells themselves or what they remember, what they associate with the various life events. And there was also, I believe, some inter-parish rivalry about who had the best bells So, people, it's definitely part of the parish, but exactly how much, so I'm not so much sure.
What was the process for making a church bell chime in Shakespeare's lifetime?
I mean, the clapper was usually often made. Actually, it's been very hard to find definite information about the clapper itself. Folk talk so much about the bell, they forget the clapper. I think it would either be bronze or sometimes iron, hung by an iron staple from inside the bell. And sometimes you did hit them with a hammer. But the English bells, especially the big church bells, were definitely more rung, swung from side to side with the clapper striking the bell itself.
And the clapper, for those that don't know what that is it's like a long metal stick with a ball at one end that hangs from the center of the inside of the bell.
Yes.
Is that shape, though, the way that it was made in the 16th century, or would it have been shaped differently?
Again, that's one of these things. I'm not very sure that people actually paid so much attention to it because the clapper itself moves so much and it was attached to an iron staple inside the bell.
As long as it made noise, they were happy with it.
Yes, but also I think I suspect that might have needed replaced more often than the bell itself, if you see what I mean, because it was rocking back and forth so often. But again, I haven't found much evidence about that one way or the other. It's funny.
Well, bells do have a really distinctive shape. And
yes.
You mentioned or alluded to earlier that they probably would have put a stop to the bell ringing if it was making a horrible sound, which makes me wonder whether or not there were any standards in place or processes to test the way that a bell sounded before it was, hoisted and hung. When they're making it, how are they deciding, yes, this bell is finished and it's going to sound the way we want it to when we go to hang it up?
Well, again, it depends partly how much they wanted to listen to the experts, but if they know roughly how much money they have and how big they want it to be, then the bell finder would be able to advise on how much to expect for they would often, sometimes it seems, know that they have a bell that sounds deep. Maybe they need a bell that sounds higher. So maybe they want a set of bells that sound certain sounds that would, sound good to them. And that's part of it, is that it has to sound good to them. Again, I've not found definite mention of them being tested on the ground before they went up, but I'm pretty sure that given that they did in fact tune the bells using, there was bits being written in the 16th, 17th century about tuning the bell by using a chisel to carve some of the metal off the inside. If you do it carefully in the right place, you can tune the bell more carefully to the note you want. So they would expect it. They would obviously want it to sound good, and they would argue about with you if it didn't.
So it may not have been standardized to the point like we're not able to find manuals or like a list of here's how you do this, but there definitely was a standard in terms of the bell founder himself. He knew what he wanted this to sound like when he was finished. Well,
there was, to some extent, I need to add that to the list. There's essentially a man called Pinocchio Berenguccio, who died in 1540, wrote an entire treatise on metals and metallurgy and such like, including pages on bell founding. And he has a chart showing the size of bells and associated weights of metal to use and such like to get the right kind of sound. So, music was kind of science back then. So they had, getting outside my area of expertise, but they had expectations of how we have chords, so you go A, B, C, D or C, D, whatever. They had the similar sort of ideas of what a bell should be like. So, yes, they would specify it, and the founder would hopefully make the right bell and it would sound good next to the other ones. Otherwise, they might end up in disputation or something. Or else they'd moaned about it for 2 or 3 generations until someone paid for a better bell to be made.
I'm imagining some village that had an enormous bell made for their church and they hung it up and it sounds horrible. And now that's just a very hilarious image in my head.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's that bell again. They didn't do it right. But now, one famous bell from Shakespeare's lifetime that you already mentioned is Great Tom of Lincoln. Now, this was hung at Lincoln Cathedral, and I believe it was cast in 1610, but correct me on the date there if I don't have that right. But tell us more about this particular bell in particular. It's fun because it would have been in place during Shakespeare's lifetime. He would have known about this bell.
In one sense, the most fun about it is that it was apparently 6 foot 3.5 inches in diameter and weighed around 88 or 9,500 weight, which was about 4.4 tons, according to the man who measured it in 1827 when it cracked, which isn't necessarily the same weight as some other people have given it. So it's amazing how much disagreement there can be even just about an obvious large object like a bell. But you can imagine if it's 6 foot in diameter, there's no wonder they called it Great Tom, and it may well have been made very near the cathedral to make it easier to deal with.
Based on what you were saying about how they transfer them, I would think that would almost be a requirement, because I'm not sure they would have the technology to move something larger any great distance.
Yes, exactly. Or moving it's one thing, but moving it safely is another, because the whole point about bell metal is that it's an alloy of tin and copper, but it has a lot more tin in it than you would normally use. So it's, in order to be very sonorous and make a nice noise when you hit it, it's actually liable to crack. And that's what happened to Great Tom after probably nearly 200 years, just over 200 years of being hit by the clapper. It cracked in December 1827. So what they did was they got a quote or two for various things to do about recasting it. And the price of about £200 to £250 was, I think, the one they went with, which in 1827 is, I think, somewhat close to someone's yearly wage, or certainly quite a few months of it anyway.
That just sounds enormous. And it's so neat that, I mean, we're saying that it makes it prone to crack, but that's close to 200 years, over 200 years that it lasted
it's
before.
A danger.
So
if you dropped it a few feet onto a hard floor, it might break into pieces, but it's not, I've broken up a miscast bell myself with a hammer, and you put it on the anvil and give it a couple of good hits and it breaks up quite easily into chunks. So they're a lot harder to break up, say, than your normal bronze alloy, which is about 10% tin to copper, the rest copper, by weight, that is. So it is a danger. So hence they do actually get recast. And sometimes when they're recast, they add a bit more metal, or else they take a bit away, and they effectively completely remake it. And of course, there were improvements in the technology between 1610 and 1827. So I'm sure that the recast Great Tom would carry on for a few hundred more years without any trouble. And the fact is, there's still medieval bells in churches around England, but not necessarily being rung as often as they would have been.
I was looking up the price conversion there, and £250 in 1827 is about £26,000 in today's money. So, I mean, that was easily someone's annual paycheck of a laborer or something. I would assume. I mean, that's a lot of money today.
Yes.
I think my first job paid less than that.
Oh yeah. Yes, exactly. If it had only weighed half a ton, I'm sure getting it down would have been a lot easier and a lot cheaper. But if it weighs at least 4.4 tons, then that's actually quite a lot of work. That would kill someone if it landed on them.
Yeah, it would kill a couple of people.
Yeah, exactly.
Not to mention what it would break between where it was. Were church bells the only kind of bells? I mean, we're talking about cathedral bells and things, but would bells of another kind have been made in Shakespeare's lifetime? Effectively,
yes, because there are also small handbells, which either you ring them to call attention, or else they're part of some whatever musical thing you're putting on, and you hit them with a hammer or something. And then there's also various small bells. Again, they were definitely more popular in the medieval period, but I'm sure they were around for entertainers or jugglers or whoever else, jesters, anyone that wants a nice little small sort of 2-inch long or 2-inch around bell to just rumble bells, for instance. They're just small spherical bells with a piece of metal or pebble inside them, and to make a sort of bell-like sound. They're not very nice compared to church bells, but for an entertainer, that's the sort of thing you'd have to get people's attention or play along with the music. And just one thing about names of bells as well. I found a mention in a book called The Church Bells of Leicestershire, that there was a bell called Gabriel in Leicestershire because it was used to call the faithful to the Angelus pre-Reformation, since Gabriel was the angel of the Annunciation. So sometimes we name the bell after an angel because of it, the job the bell did.
That's fantastic. Where are these recorded? I mean, was it common for the church bell to have a name, or was it only these that were, either uniquely huge or put in for a particular purpose that were actually given a moniker?
I haven't found much about all of them being named, if you see what I mean. It does only seem to be specific ones that were either, as you say, stood out in some way, or were very commonly used because you'd hear it every day. And there's Gabriel calling me to Angelus again, I better go, sort of thing.
Now, you mentioned a minute ago that how church bells would be tuned sometimes, but I wonder about other maintenance. I mean, would somebody have to climb up there in the church steeple to clean the bell on a regular basis? Are there any records about how these bells were maintained?
I haven't seen anything about cleaning per se. I mean, you'd want to keep the pigeons out, hopefully, and maybe give it a wee dust down every now and then. And if they're held on with iron straps, you definitely want to make sure it stays quite dry up there. So if they weren't inspecting them every now and then, I would be very surprised. And obviously in modern times, we'd have a inspection book and you'd sign it all off. They weren't so diligent about it, but people would have been paying attention, I'm sure, especially the ringers, because they're the ones that will have a bell fall on their head if they get it wrong. So I'm sure they were checking them, but they didn't necessarily have to do very much, of course, because like it's the brass, the bronze doesn't go anywhere as long as everything's safe and not rotted or rusted or anything, then it should be fine.
What about a marking? Would the foundry or the person who was casting the bell have put a stamp on it, or are there any surviving bells that have dates on them to show when they were cast?
Yes, actually, there's quite a lot of, basically, most of them would have some kind of marking on them, because sometimes they had just a letter K or an L or something as some kind of marker of the foundry that made it, whereas many others had full inscriptions on them. There's an interesting thesis by John Ketteringham back in about 1990 or so called the use of church bells in the Diocese of Lincoln, and there's a lot of pre-Reformation bells have inscriptions like "Cum voce sonora Tomam campana laudit," which translates as "the bell praises Thomas with a sonorous call," or "Sum rosa pulsata mundi Caterina vocata. I being rung am called Catherine, the rose of the world." And then post-Reformation, they change a wee bit, shall we say, one being, for instance, "Jesus be our speed," or else "God save our Queen," or "God save his church," or another one that was cast in 1585 in Northamptonshire, "A trusty friend is hard to find." So there's obvious changes going on even in Shakespeare's lifetime about what kind of bells, or what the bells say on the side. Another one in 1589 from Borough-le-Marsh, wherever that is, suggests that the donor of the money for the bell was a keen bell ringer, because it said William Pollen chimed so well he paid for the casting of this bell. And you did often get the name of the founder on them, such as at Knowsley, bells inscribed Thomas Heselrigg, Esquire, made me in 1596.
I love that they're written from the bell's perspective.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I wouldn't want to go too far into hypothesizing, but, it makes them sound a lot more alive and part of the family almost. Yeah,
it's really a neat perspective. Well, I know that we would like to look into the history of bells further and to chase some of these rabbit trails we've identified for exactly what was going on with bells in Shakespeare's lifetime. So what can you recommend for us from your research into this topic? Where should we start if we want to learn more?
I mean, it depends. If you're just talking about England, of course, I mean, there's the rest of the world as well, but frankly, we didn't have as many bells in Scotland because we were a bit poorer and we never really took off with change rigging. But there's some useful sources online, such as several theses, like Ketteringham's one that I've just mentioned, and some books from the 19th century have useful things like inscriptions and other information, some of which may not be correct, but, it's a good starting place. And there's various books such as Temporary Site Bell Finding Technology by Trevor Jennings, which is about itinerant bell finders and what they did. And I mentioned the Vannocchio Beneguccio's book goes into some detail. For 1540, it's an amazing textbook, tells you exactly what to do about all sorts of things, not just bell casting. Then there's an interesting book called English Medieval Industries, which is quite old, but quite accurate and useful, and has a couple of pages on bells, and mentioned things like there's actually a 14th century manuscript illustration showing someone chiseling a bell to tune it better. And yes, I would also happily talk for a few more minutes about how the bells are made, if you don't mind.
Oh, yes, I would love to hear that. Go ahead.
That was kind of how I got into it, was the bronze casting.
Yes, because you were mentioning that you do some of the bronze casting.
Yes, I have yet to actually make I think I've only made one item successfully in bronze casting because it turned out to be very difficult. And there's a reason you have a 7-year apprenticeship for it. Actually, no, we've made a couple bells as well in sand casting that worked, but that's not quite the right technology for mid-late 16th century. Yes, so essentially the bell metal, they've analysed various bells over the years and found roughly between about 20 to 25 weight% tin and the rest copper. And sometimes there's a bit of lead, which is not good because it takes away the sonority of it. It doesn't sound as good. And allegedly, there's some suggestion he used to add silver, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. And even if they did, it wouldn't make too much difference. So essentially, to make a bell, you start with a foundry, whether it's temporary or permanent. And a permanent one would have proper covered up furnace and spaces to dry and burn things in and all the rest of it. And then you need a furnace and a pit dug next to it to hold the bell mold, because basically when you pour the hot metal into it, the hot metal is so strong and powerful that it can break the mold itself open. So it's much better to put it underground and fill it up with sand or soil gently around it just to make sure it's all right. And then you can pour the metal in, and even if it bursts, there won't be any harm to you, because molten bronze at over 1,000 degrees C will effectively burn your hand off or kill you in some other way if you're not very careful with it. You know, it's quite amazing to see this glowing liquid that runs very easily across the ground or out your crucible, but also you've got to be a bit careful with it, otherwise there will be horrible accidents. So we have a foundry, and they're often made quite near rivers because the actual material they needed for making the mold, usually known as loam, generally had clay and sand in it, and then they would add straw or other organic material. So the point about a bell is, when you're casting a bell, is the metal needs to run into a space. So you have to create the space between two layers of material that will withstand 1,000 degrees C metal. And that material is clay, sand, horse dung, straw, that sort of thing. So the earlier medieval times, what they tended to use looks like it was more lost wax process. So they'd take a piece of wood or other thing like that, take the clay mixture, the loam, and smooth it around this wood, and then mount it on a lathe. And again, you can see this in the window in York Minster, I think, has it, actual medieval stained glass illustrations of how to make a bell. So you have this bell on its side, and you effectively keep turning it round and carve it like you do when you're doing wood carving on the wood carving thing that turns round. Anyway.
I think that's called a lathe as well.
Lathe, yes, of course, yeah. It's a lathe as well, yes. So you have it on its lathe, sideways, carve the shape of the loam until it's about the right shape for the inside of the bell. Earlier, they weren't necessarily as accurate as they could be, but later they got much better at it. And then you cover it in wax, often tallow, in fact, sheets of tallow if you're doing it in the winter, because you want something that's a bit soft but not too soft. So you can then cover it in the sheets, try and get the thickness of the sheets right, and then you cover it in more loam. Simple as that, having first turned it on the lathe to make sure that the shape of the tallow was the right shape for the bell. Then you cover it in more loam, then you let it dry for a wee while. So the loam, which, is wet, moist clay and sand and dung and other things like that, so it needs to dry for a while. Then you can gently warm it up and then heat it up enough so the tallow or beeswax or mixture such like melts out of it. Then you have to fire the mold even higher to easily 500-600 degrees at least, all the way through. So that can take a couple of days, because you have to 2 by 3 foot thing, big lump of clay that must weigh quite a few tens of kilograms anyway, with a hollow in the middle that is bell shaped, but it won't be able to take the weight and heat of the metal until the clay is fired. So like your ceramic mug at home, you could actually probably pour bronze into some of them and they wouldn't necessarily shatter very quickly. And even if they did, they wouldn't react with the mug, because the fired clays and metal just don't really react. So great, that's exactly what you need to make the mold with. So you make the mold, dry it, fire it, make sure you've stopped up any holes you might have from letting the wax run out, and then you put it in the pit and lead the metal into it, and then wait a day or two to cool down, and then you can start breaking it off. So of course they found tons of broken molds in various sites in Exeter and Worcester and York and such like. So they know the shape of the mould is very distinctive because, of course, it's the mirror image of the bell itself being around the outside or the inside. So they know, this is from a bell, and we can measure this and give us a rough idea of what size of bell it was used to make. And then the interesting thing as well, from a history of technology sort of point of view, is that in sort of later medieval time and in Shakespeare's time, in England especially, but I believe elsewhere, they'd also gotten much better at using a kind of loam instead of the wax, because apparently the loam makes it easier to be more precise about the shape of the bell. So they have the one recipe of loam that is used for the actual material of the mould, and they have a sort of different recipe that is mostly just weak clay and sand or something, very, very soft mixture. And you run that on the lathe the same as the other mixtures, such that you can get much more precise shape of the bell. And because it's a bit firmer than the wax, when you make the bell itself up, there's less chance of maybe distortions in the size or shape or holes appearing, because you can properly put the outer layer on. And then what you actually do is you dry it off, lift the outer layer, the coat off, then sort of carefully scrape off the inside loam bit, the sort of soft loam. Then you put the outer coat back on, make sure it's all carefully sealed around the bottom with clay, and then fire the whole lot. And that seems to be more accurate and useful for making bigger and better and bells that sound better and that have a more precise tone to them, because, they knew the bells sounded better the better they were cast in the proper size and shape and all the rest of it. But getting it right is another matter.
I didn't realize they had to destroy the mold. Does that mean they had to remake the mold every time?
Yes. Yep. Every time.
Wow. And this was a multi-person process, because we're talking a big piece of metal. So getting it in there, getting it out, and finalizing it, and all these steps, that had to have been a team of people working on that.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I would imagine that certainly there's mention of obviously the master founder himself, who's the one that does most of the business and talks about it with people and is given the money and everything. And he would have had very probably an apprentice and possibly a boy or two, or a journeyman or two or something. It's from my own experience trying to run a replica bronze foundry. I know it takes 2 or 3 people to really actually do it properly, partly because you've got to keep an eye on everything. One person needs to watch the furnace and feed it when necessary. And if someone else needs to make the mould up, maybe it takes 2 people to make the mould. If it's a bell on a lathe, you need one person holding the tool to shape the bell and another one to turn the lathe. So that's 2 people. So that's why it would easily take a week or 2 to make a bell. And it's not guaranteed to work. We know about sometimes it didn't, because there's various court cases in the records all across the late medieval, early modern period of bells that people paid for bells and they either didn't get a bell, or the bell they got didn't sound quite right, or it cracked as soon as they tried to use it. So of course they blamed the founder.
See Liberty Bell.
Yes, that's the one. Yes. Just trying to remember it. Yeah. So it's surprisingly difficult. Oh yes, and the rest of the time, since bell making might only take a month a year, the rest of the time they would make more normal stuff like candlesticks and cauldrons and so on. That there was a big rise in bronze cauldrons used in England in the sort of 14th century onwards.
I hadn't even thought about bronze cauldrons. Now I have a whole nother metal making tangent to follow. That's exciting. Although I would like to mention that I think all of this detail and how much work it takes to make a bell, I feel like it only taking a couple of weeks to complete is actually pretty fast.
Yes. I mean, that's a rough estimate. I don't actually know of any definite, it's not like people are keeping helpful diaries, unfortunately, but I don't see why it wouldn't take much more than a couple of weeks. But sometimes you do need to just leave it to dry for several days, or cool down for a day or 2. For, small bronze items can be ready to break out the mold in 10, 20 minutes. But once you get to, even once you get to a bell, even a small bell that's about 10 inches high, that can take an hour or something to cool down properly. You might break it out the mold after half an hour, but it still takes quite a bit longer to cool down, just because there's so much heat in the metal. And the furnace itself, for casting bells by Shakespeare's time, they were using something, they're more using something called a reverberatory furnace, which could be 3 meters long by 2 meters high by 2 meters wide. And that used wood at one end, and the flames were carefully led over the metal, and the heat reverberated off the roof down onto the metal and melted it all in a great big pool in the middle of the furnace. And then you could tap the side of it, a pre-made hole that was blocked. You knock the blockage out of the way, and then the metal runs down a gutter or such that you've made to take it. So that's surprisingly simple sounding, but getting it right takes quite a lot of practice and skill, which of course you can also argue Shakespeare has with words, which is kind of getting the skill and the practice in you in being good at doing something like that.
I read somewhere the other day that talent is simply being willing to practice. That being talented at anything is just about how often you're willing to get good at it. So
yes, I definitely need to do more practice, but it's surprisingly, yes, the amount of resources needed for it. You know, even just trying to do small scale bronze casting, you know, we might use 10 kilograms, so that's what, 22 pounds or something of charcoal a day without any trouble at all. And we could use more if we were trying for bigger castings.
Yeah, just the sheer amount of wood that I think, and trees that went into the making of these things. I mean, it's astounding. Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
How about the complete works of Walter Scott? That would keep me busy for a while.
I think that's a good choice. You would definitely be able to dig in with that one on your deserted island. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, basically, life's been a bit too hectic the last few years. So now I need to actually pause and try and write up various things, such as my own research in alchemy. I want to actually try and cast a proper bell that works using historic methods and various things like that. So that's kind of what I want to try and do over the next year. There's also a chapter on the book about reenactment that I'm involved in that I need to finish trying to write bits for as well.
That sounds like great things coming forward for you. I would love it if you would keep up with us and let us know how the proper bell casting goes, especially using the historic methods. We'd love to see how that turns out. Thank you so much, Guthrie Stewart, for being here this week and taking us through the history of bells for Shakespeare's lifetime, famous bells that he would have known about, and exactly how they were made. This was really a fun conversation. Thank you for being here to share it with us.
You're welcome.
More information on Guthrie Stewart, along with the resources he recommends for you today, are helpfully organized into a nicely clickable list, all on our show notes page today. It's available at CassidyCash.com/episode 370. While you're there, if you want to dive in depth to more visual history about the history of church bells in Shakespeare's lifetime, you can access the detailed show notes on the regular show notes page by logging in as a patron. You can also join at that same link if you're not already a supporter, but you really want to see the extras. That's okay. You can click on the link too, and you'll be prompted and it'll walk you through how to do that. Again, that URL for this week is CassidyCash.com/episode 370. If you are totally sold out about the history of the 16th and 17th century and you can't wait to dive into games, recipes, and crafts just like what William Shakespeare would have had available to him, then you will really love my collection of history activity kits I have on Patreon. These are called Experience Shakespeare, and each one is a hands-on history activity kit. It's a lot like science labs, but for Shakespeare history. You get to cook, play, and create your way through the life of William Shakespeare. Find out more and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.